So first things first, Secret of the Mimic trailer, it's good, and I was right about like 95% of it. That's all I'll say. Anyway, I went on Twitter and Blue Sky and asked you to give me your best FNAF hot takes, and what did I get? Well, a lot. So I'm gonna run through some of these hot takes and give my opinions on them and rank each hot take on the new, demuted, owned, and copyrighted Sizzleometer. If your hot take is piping hot, fresh out of the hot oven, eat the food, then it gets a 10. If your hot take is actually cold as hell and more bitter than a Twitter incel, it will get a 1 or 0. With that out of the way, let's begin. Starting with my friend Fact Attack, who also edits my videos from time to time. Sister Location isn't as bad as people make it out to be. I think some people dislike it so much because it's the game that feels like FNAF took a turn tonally. It has some of my favorite characters, and I think if it wasn't mainline or was its own thing, people would like it more. And while I get what Fact is saying here, I just disagree. The problem with Sister Location isn't that the game itself is awful, it's that it changes so much of what made FNAF FNAF. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? That's up to you. Personally, I do think Sister Location would work better as a spin-off or something like that, but it leaves such a lingering imprint on the series that even now, it's one of the most talked about games in it. All of that for a package I think is just mediocre at best. I think Ennard, Funtime Freddy, Ballora, those guys are some of my favorite characters in the series, but as a whole, I just can't agree with this take. We'll give it a 5 out of 10, lukewarm soup. Next is Preston C3PO. FNAF 2 Custom Night is better than the FNAF SL Custom Night, and is the best custom night in the entire series, not including Ultimate Custom Night. And this is a very hot take, I feel, right off the bat, because I genuinely don't know if I've ever seen someone bat for FNAF 2's Custom Night like this. However, I have to agree. Sister Location's Custom Night is the best part about that game, yes, but it's also one of the most mediocre custom nights in FNAF history. Not including Baby or Ennard is a massive miss in my opinion, especially since Ennard was already programmed to work in the exact office that the custom night takes place in. But is FNAF 2's custom night better? Honestly, that comes down to what you value. I love the hectic nature of it, but still find it to generally be fun, beatable, and rewarding. The prizes you get for beating the individual challenges are adorable, and unlike Sister Location, you have the entire game before the custom night teaching you how to beat it. So overall, I'll give this one an 8 out of 10, hot sausages. There's actually a lot of hot takes I saw specifically regarding FNAF 2, so I figure I may as well burn through some of them here. And actually, the next two come from content creators you might know, Underscore and The Baz, both of whom I'm either friends with or I've even made videos with. Let's start with Underscore. Of the original FNAF games, FNAF 2 and mainly Sister Location are the best for their atmosphere, story, and world building, but they simultaneously have the most dogshit gameplay of those old games too. This is one I kind of have to agree with, aside from admitting that Sister Location has any gameplay at all, and that FNAF 2 is bad. I think FNAF 2 is loads of fun, and aside from 4, remains my favorite of the original Scott Cawthon titles when it comes to gameplay. But I will admit I agree that 2 and Sister Location were the best for world building in terms of quantity. I just don't think what Sister Location introduced was all that good. Like, even though I get what Remnant is, it's very hard to articulate it, and I still believe if you cut Elizabeth Afton out of the FNAF story entirely, not all that much changes. So all in all, I'm gonna give this a 7 out of 10. Red pepper on pizza. Now we have Isaac the Baddest, big time friend of the channel, not so big time friend of Security Breach. FNAF 2 is still one of the best games because of its story elements. Every FNAF game has bad gameplay, the mystery is the appeal, and FNAF 2 contributes to the lore in some of the best ways. Now I mostly agree with this except for one statement. Every FNAF game has bad gameplay. I do kind of agree with this with the clarification that every FNAF game contains bad gameplay, not that every FNAF game's gameplay is bad. Like, sometimes FNAF 1 can be very frustrating, and you do pretty much just have to check one camera the whole game. FNAF 2 can be equally as repetitive and even more unfair. FNAF 3, a lot of people didn't like the Phantoms, fun with Glitchtrap sucks in FNAF 4, Sister Location's entirety, etc, etc. Overall, I'll give this a 9 out of 10 on the Sizzleometer, Ghost Pepper Wings. Moving on from FNAF 2, I want to touch on some of the more random hot takes that cropped up here and there. Yosh E says, Ballora isn't that hot. A hot take I will not be ranking because I think it's just true. Like, I know the FNAF fandom is full of degenerates, but are we really throwing ourselves at this? Come on, do better. Mr. Bucketley says, I'm tired of My Name is Edwin. I'm sorry. 5 out of 10. Charlie Art 16 says, FNAF 1 is not overrated, just didn't age well. It's still a fun game even if you know everything. And while I respect this take a lot, I just disagree. You're fine to like what you like even if you like Sister Location, like I've repeatedly enjoyed dunking on it in this video. I firmly believe there's no such thing as an objective opinion, but I also think FNAF 1 is the single easiest game in the series to get burnt out on, because once you know all there is to know, that age really rears its ugly head. I can't even get good footage of this game through OBS. For those who don't know, this is what my footage actually looks like when I record it. I have to finagle it to make it look somewhat decent in my videos. Overall, I give this one a 7 out of 10 because I agree with it mostly, but I also think it's just not as fun as it used to be. This next one is a hot take I actually saw a couple times, but I picked this one purely because I wanted to read the name out loud because I love it. Transmask Sonic says, I think the Vengeful Spirit should have been Charlie. This is something I had never even thought of before this hot takes video, but is one I found myself agreeing with purely because I hate Golden Freddy. Not as a concept, but as a character, because fuck Scott for giving us nothing with this guy continually. But Charlie is not only well connected to the story and understood, but they also make the most sense if they were Afton's first victim. Which they could be, we don't know. For that, I'm giving the first 10 out of 10, the spiciest, hottest take so far. We're talking the gluttonous Reaper chili dog of hot takes. And not just because it's Transmask Sonic, but because chili dogs are delicious. This leads me to a lot of the lore-oriented hot takes. Jackie was here, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, says, I think people give Scott too much credit for his lore, world building, and mysteries. So many times people have connected extremely reasonable dots that create a worse story in return, and then Scott has to come outright and say it's wrong to avoid the outrage or leave us guessing. This is just a take I can't agree with at all. I think the inverse is actually true. Fans give themselves too much credit for making the series what it is. And I think recent years especially have really shown us that theorists can be and often are wrong. And what Scott, Megacats, and Steelwool are doing is following their own story. Granted, a lot of what they're doing now seems reactionary to the negative reception of Security Breach's story and the theories that sprang up from it, but in my eyes, this is an outlier because Scott was so hands-off with Security Breach, and Steelwool tried telling their own story using his pieces. But I don't think the Mimic is a response to Gregbot or anything like that. I'm gonna have to give this one a 2 out of 10. It's not the worst because I think back when the original games were coming out, this definitely may have been true to an extent. But as it stands now, I just don't buy it. Melted Popsicle. This next one was split across 2 tweets, but the second tweet is really just reiterating and reinforcing the first part, so I'll just be reading the first one. Sorry, you get one screenshot just like everyone else. Madness Poison says, it's not only MatPat's fault the lore went sci-fi, but it's his specific punishment. Scott would have used FNAF World to bridge the gaps in the old lore, but Dream Theory was proposed midway through its development, and it almost tore the community apart. Again, I think this is just giving the fandom too much credit for where FNAF has gone. Did MatPat and Scott have a specific relationship in the past? Yes, but so far as we can tell, that was only in the sense that Scott would try to make his stories more difficult to solve. He didn't seem to base his stories off of what MatPat said. And especially with FNAF World, I believe what you're saying is that Scott saw Dream Theory and changed FNAF World to disprove it. And I don't think that was the case, simply because FNAF World still works with Dream Theory anyway. And also, the idea that Scott gets this close to finishing a game only to then change it because MatPat got it right, I think is a bit of a fantasy. I could be misinterpreting your message, and if I am sorry. But I'm giving this hot take another 2 out of 10. Alex Chow, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but I definitely didn't do that one right, says the FNAF series is very aggressive to newcomers. I agree. I think that FNAF as a whole can be very hard for new fans to get into, which is why I'm glad Secret of the Mimic seems to be very upfront with everything so far. This one isn't really a hot take, in fact it's very common, but I still agree with it, so I'm giving it a 5 out of 10. Next is actually another big theorist, ID's Fantasy. I would be thrilled to see more characters and plot points from the first arc show up in this one. I enjoy them, and I like the irony that the failed attempt to destroy the past, Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, is the foundation of the future, Pizzaplex. And this is a take I'm kind of half and half on, because if we're talking about a sequel to Security Breach, I honestly don't want to see a slew of old faces return, as I think it would further muddy an already complicated story. However, since Steelwool and Megacats seem to be making prequel games now, I think it only makes sense to see some old characters return, or it feels like a missed opportunity. So while I do agree somewhat, I honestly can't say I agree fully. 7 out of 10. Drakard the Vampire says, Glitchtrap being more Afton than Mimic is more of an interesting narrative to me about how Afton's legacy lives on, even when he is gone and out of the picture. Glitchtrap being fully Mimic just kinda makes me sad because it means we couldn't see a true end to William in the games. Doesn't really matter anymore though since Glitchtrap is dead. To this, I really only have to say that I think if Afton is not Glitchtrap, he definitely got a satisfying ending, burning to death in Pizza Sim and living out his own personal hell in UCN. He only really doesn't get a satisfying ending if you ask me in the Fazbear Frights books, But even still, he's defeated, and that's all we can really ask for, I think. I've always been pro-Mimic Glitchtrap as well, and I think that alone carries the idea of Afton's legacy bleeding into the future even when he's gone. So I get this hot take, but I don't think it's very substantial. 6 out of 10. And the last of these more lore-related ones comes from Peepaw Willie. It would have been more horrifying if William intentionally springlocked himself, since he knows that the animatronics are possessed, an immensely disturbed way of getting away with the crimes he's committed. Now, this comes down to interpretation, but I personally think it works better as an accident, because that would be the first time William is really defeated. Taking away that defeat means he's basically unstoppable until FNaF 6, which I think overall makes the story less interesting and makes Springtrap less powerful imagery. It basically turns Springtrap from this tortured mistake Afton made into zombie Iron Man, at least in my eyes. 4 out of 10. Hayden Ogden says Help Wanted 1 is pretty overrated. The remakes of the original FNaF games kind of take the fun out of the OG games by making it so you can do multiple tasks at once. And the original levels are nothing special compared to Help Wanted 2's fun and charming levels. This is an opinion I agree with and see cropping up more gradually over time. And truth to be told, it is very hard for me to go back to the base Help Wanted 1 in a positive light. Everything Hayden said here is true. The remakes suck, the original minigames suck, the only one I kinda like is Animatronic Repair until that sucks, and what are we left with? An inferior FNaF game. 10 out of 10. DameCat33 says most of the old games are not enjoyable to play. The new games have vastly superior gameplay. Now this may be the hottest take of the entire video, but unfortunately, it's not one I can really agree with. To say none of the original games are enjoyable is just not true. They're beloved by many and have amazing arcade-like qualities. Personally, I do think Help Wanted 2 has maybe the best gameplay in the series, but that's like comparing the entire United States to Wyoming. It's just bigger with more to do. So although I disagree, I'm gonna have to give props for the bravery on this one. 6 out of 10. And for our last string, I want to talk about hot takes specifically related to the books because, man, people had their thoughts about those things. Number 1 Sammy fan says people blindly hate anything from the books no matter how well written or planned out they are because it ruins their headcanons and makes things more clear. Thank you, Sammy fan. You said what the book fans have all been thinking. And saying. Granted, I'll be blunt, if everything in the FNaF books are canon, then woo, we have got some rewriting to do for the whole timeline, but nevertheless, I think at this point, there's no denying it, at least for the Tales from the Pizzabox books. I'm sure someone will find a way to still deny it, but whatever. I do think it's a bit rough to pin all book hate on angry theorists because we can't pretend these books are masterpieces or anything. One of the worst stories I've ever read was Bleeding Heart, and that's a Tales from the Pizzabox story. Just because microbots that give you peeled skin tattoos are probably canon, doesn't mean I'm excited about it. Still, I think Sammy fan here hit the nail on the head for what I can imagine is the large majority of book-hating theorists. 8 out of 10. Next is Zion Brown. People complain about the existence of the books, but if they hadn't existed, I don't think FNaF would still be around or have the staying power it does today. This is an interesting one because it's not about whether or not the books are canon or even good, it's about how their existence serves the series, and I agree with this. Because the old FNaF games came out so quickly, there was never really a need for supplemental material, but now that there's more space between releases, I think having that material around is a very good thing to keep people engaged with the series. If FNaF wasn't releasing these books, game theory probably would have dried up on stuff to talk about, and when that happens, other theorists stop, and the series goes totally dormant on the fandom side until the next game drops. So I think the books are in general a net positive for the series. 10 out of 10. Nighthawk says, the Mimic should have stayed in the book series. It would be fine if it was in a spin-off game like Into the Pit, but it doesn't belong in the mainline FNaF franchise. This is where I get sort of defensive, but the main thing I want to bring up is that if the Mimic did stay in the books only, the books themselves would become basically useless as tools. And that's not what Scott wanted, clearly. I do agree, just like everyone else, that the Mimic should have debuted in an actual FNaF game before the books, and he arguably did if you count Burntrap or Glitchtrap, but I can't help but feel that there will always be some truth to the Mimic kind of feeling like an asspull. But even still, it's not like the Mimic is the first FNaF character to originate from a book to then be put in a game. We had Henry way before. Technically Afton if you count his name. I think all in all that this complaint is just one I hear often and just don't care to really take seriously anymore. 3 out of 10. And I would like to end on a very interesting hot take that I want to know what you guys think of. Freddy Snazbear, great name by the way, says, I like where the games are now, but I also wouldn't be opposed to a full-on reboot down the line once the Mimic saga is done. Scott is probably well aware there's a yearning for a little return to form, and I personally struggle to see where the story could even go post-Mimic. There's a lot to unpack here, but the big thing is that I agree. I think FNaF could be rebooted, and honestly ironing out what does and doesn't work I think could only make the series stronger. Like, if we cut Remnant out of the story, does it change anything? Probably not, which means the story can be streamlined and made stronger. That's just an example. But the way it stands, I honestly doubt Scott would go this route, or at least if he did, it wouldn't matter all that much. It's easy to forget that Help Wanted 1 basically did reboot the series. It was just done in a very subtle way that didn't outright declare the old games to be non-canon. As it stands, I would love to see a rebooted FNaF in the future, a full hard reboot, but I agree that I'm pretty happy where the games are now. 9 out of 10. And that's it for FNaF Hot Takes. Maybe I'll do a video like this again in the future. Let me know what you think of this video in the comments down below. I'm Demuted, be sure to subscribe, and peace.